Hi, everyone. I'm Jordan Crow. I'm the Senior Director for Policy and Programs in Washington, D.C. Today, we've got a fantastic panel lined up today focused on fuel supply and generation. This is part of our Gridiron four-part series we'll be doing this year with the Earthshot Foundation. A huge thanks to the Earthshot Foundation for underwriting this series this year, much less the series they did last year with us on critical minerals and supply chains. With that said, Mariko will be leading the discussion today. Mariko, if you'd like to come on the screen here. Mariko is the co-founder and chief energy economist at Lumen Energy Strategy. She has also recently become the senior fellow and chief energy economist for the Earthshot Foundation. Mariko, with that being said, I will let you take us from here and lead the discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, OEP, for hosting this webinar, to the Earthshot Foundation team, and to all of our 2025 Gridiron Dialogue participants. It's my honor to introduce our esteemed panel. If you wouldn't mind coming on video, our panel includes today Camilo Serna, Senior VP of Strategy and External Engagement at the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, Melissa Alfano, Senior Director of Energy Markets and Counsel at the Solar Energy Industries Association, and Benton Arnett, Senior Director of Markets and Policy at the Nuclear Energy Institute. Welcome, Camilo, Melissa, and Benton, and thank you for being here. Each of you has helped the industry navigate through major transitions, and we're eager to hear your thoughts today. So I'll get started. In the Gridiron Dialogue series, we aim to identify pathways to energy abundance through a whole grid view. And understanding what's going on with fuel supply is certainly the first step in that. When we take that view, we see how massive and complex the grid is, and it's surprising in a way how quickly the grid can change, not only in its infrastructure, but in how it operates and what we ask of it. Could each of you speak to how the role of natural gas, nuclear, and solar in the US has changed from even, say, 5 or 10 years ago? And I'll turn to Camilo to get us started on that. The floor is yours, Camilo.
Thank you, Mariko, and thank you, Jordan. Thank you to the OurEnergyPolicy.org Foundation for this. I think it is always helpful to get together a few of us to talk about the dynamics and the changing resource mix. So if you look at the resource mix on the generation here in North America, we've seen significant change over the last 10 years. I mean, you had traditionally built a system that relied on coal, hydro, nuclear, baseload capacity that it was kind of, to some degree, easy to plan for. And as you thought about planning for the grid, it was easy. But over the last 5-10 years, we've seen a significant increase on the amount of natural gas and renewables coming to the system. And we expect that to continue to be the case. Just the numbers I have for natural gas, top of mind. Natural gas was only 15% production 20 years ago. Now it's 40-45%. And in some regions, especially during the winter, this can be even greater. But I think as we look at that dynamic of a system that is changed and now is relying on what we will call weather-dependent resources like solar and wind, or just-in-time resources like natural gas. You cannot store usually the natural gas on site, like you can store a coal pile or the nuclear fuel on site. That's bringing a whole host of challenges on how we think about planning the generation system and the electric system. You need to think about weather and how weather is impacting the availability of fuel, in this case, renewable energy, or potential changes to the natural gas system can impact the availability of gas, especially during the winter time. We do see some issues. So it's been a significant transition, going back to your question, over the last 10 years that we expect to continue, obviously with different dynamics and that changes. But really where I wanted to emphasize the point here is how much that has changed, how we need to plan for the system differently. We cannot rely on the similar methods that we were using in the past. in the utility industry, we use a method where we anticipate a level of outages, and it's more on a frequency basis. We need to think more about the magnitude and duration of these, especially given where we come from. So significant change, more to come, and that's leading to changes on how we plan the system. I'll stop there and follow up later.
Thank you, Camilo. And Melissa, do you have any thoughts about how the fuel mix has changed over the last 5 to 10 years?
So, when I look at it specifically from the role of solar because, obviously, right, I work for SEIA, the Solar Industries Energy Association. But one of the things I've noticed is it hasn't changed as much as it's changing, right? So the role of solar, it's grown quite a bit over the last 5 to 10 years, right? We've seen a lot of rapid growth. So, if you think about it, since 2014, the US has added 121 gigawatts of utility and small scale solar. That is an 800% increase from about 10 years ago. Just in the last 2 years, utility scale has grown to about 8% of the total capacity, again, compared to 1% 10 years ago. And then even in the last year, all the new generating capacity added to the grid in 69% of new generating capacity added to the grid in Q1 of this year has been solar. So and EIA estimates that there's going to be even more growth. The electric power sector is going to generate about 124 billion kilowatts from solar this summer, 34% higher than last summer. And then next summer, we'll see another 19% growth. And again, that's just solar. So, we do actually, at SEIA, we don't look at just solar because that's kind of, a little boring. Also, just not what we're about. We're about solar and storage, right? You have to maximize dispatchability. You have to maximize your capacity. So when we look at storage, we see even more growth over a shorter period of time. So, you look at back at 2010, you had 7 batteries across the country with 59 megawatts, virtually nothing, right? But then you jump to about at the end of 2018, you have 125 systems with 869 megawatts. And then between 2020 and 2021, we saw capacity triple from about 1.6 gigawatts in 2020 to 5 gigawatts in 2021. And then right now we're looking at most recent numbers, about 16 gigawatts, probably higher in battery storage across the country. And then if you look at the queues and what is expected to come online, that's even more. That said, if you're looking at it compared to natural gas, coal, nuclear, it's relatively small. We're not even close to the dominant resource on the grid. Gas and coal definitely have us beat in terms of the amount of capacity, considering they've had kind of a bit of a head start. That said, and we are facing headwinds as an industry. I'm not going to sugarcoat that by any means. That said, we also have a lot of momentum coming in. So I think, this is an industry that will continue to grow over the next several years, especially as demand for these resources increase. And honestly, because our prices are decreasing, especially when you look at battery storage. Since 2021, the prices of production of those resources have significantly decreased, and we've been onshoring consistently the manufacturing needs for these resources. So it appears, based on our estimates, it's a lot faster to build a solar and a storage resource than it is to build any other resource right now, just because the manufacturing and the backlogs that we see in other resource types aren't necessarily there. So just by necessity, our role in the industry and on the grid will continue to grow. So I'm excited to see it grow too.
Thank you, Melissa. And I think it's interesting too how solar and storage, that can also be a distributed resource, and it's changing the grid in that way, and hoping to touch on that more later. Benton, how about for you, from your perspective, what are the big changes you've seen over the last 5 to 10 years in terms of fuel mix?
Yeah, thanks, Mariko, and thanks to OEP and Earthshot for having me here today. I think it's such a great time for this conversation. It's really exciting time for energy more broadly, but particularly a really exciting time for nuclear. And I'll kind of underscore that by just, thinking about what it would be like if we had this conversation 5 or 10 years ago. And the reality is, if we'd been having this conversation, we'd be talking about, how we can avoid the next nuclear power plant shutdown. Over the last about 15 years, we shut down 13 perfectly good nuclear power plants for economic reasons. And it was because there were not, the markets were not valuing the kinds of attributes that the nuclear provides. And we've seen that just turn around absolutely, completely over the last probably 3 years. And so we've seen a lot of really great announcements start to come out about restarting some of those shutdown plants. Palisades is moving forward with that this year, and then 3 Mile Island is also under the process of being restarted, and that's expected here in the next couple of years. So really exciting there. There's another nuclear power plant that's under consideration as well, Duane Arnold. No final decision's been made on that, but the fact that folks are considering it is just completely different than where we were just a couple years ago. And you add on top of that, folks are looking at making uprates. How can we get more power out of the existing facilities that we have? And I think we can get several gigawatts of that. We're looking at 3 to 5 gigawatts of new power that we can pull from that existing fleet. That's going to require a lot of investment, but I think this interest and this value of those attributes is driving a lot of that investment. So that's been very exciting. And then we're also seeing new folks are really coming to the forefront, and we're getting some really big names in here. So organizations like Google and Amazon have partnered with advanced reactor companies and made commitments to bring several gigawatts of those types online. We saw Dow Chemical partner with X Energy in Texas to actually do the first nuclear for an industrial purpose application, where they're going to use process heat from that reactor to help decarbonize a facility they have there. And so we're seeing all of these different use cases, all of this different interest, and so it's just been a really exciting time for the industry. But I always kind of preface it with that, we're not too far away from that time when we were shutting down. And so I think when folks have questions about, the rate at which we're moving, or, where capital's flowing, nuclear takes a little bit of time, and we're a slow moving industry, but we've certainly taken all of this great interest to heart, and we got some folks that are moving really, really fast now. And I think we're gonna have some really exciting news here in the next couple of years.
That is exciting to see fresh interest in nuclear. And I think hearing all three of you talk, I'm very interested in this idea of addressing reliability and affordability challenges today through a whole grid perspective, and through thinking about the grid's resources as a portfolio working together, rather than thinking, oh, we're going to have one technology or one thing that's going to solve all our problems. I don't think that's as realistic. So it's great to hear that there are a few gigawatts still in nuclear uprates, and that there are resources we can tap into on that side. Camilo, could I go back to what you mentioned? You said that natural gas has increased from 15% to around 40-45% today. I remember before that ramp up happened, gas electric coordination was a big issue. Could you talk about what that issue looks like today, and some of the work that NERC is doing to explore and understand issues around gas electric coordination?
Yeah, no, thank you. And it is a very timely topic. If you look at actually, our board is going to be considering a report tomorrow that highlights the main risks to reliability. And the first one is the change in generation mix and the increased load that we're seeing. So that's number one. Number two, not necessarily in that order, but another key risk is this interconnection, interdependency between the electric and the natural gas sectors. As I indicated, the level of generation that we're relying on the natural gas has increased, especially during the winter time, where we have some more variability on certain resources like wind and solar. the system ends up relying a lot more on the natural gas system. And by design or not, right now, the natural gas system is the backup fuel for the electric system, especially during the winter time. So if you have situations where you have a significant weather event that might take down a couple of generators, or you might not have a lot of renewables online, you look at the gas system, but then the gas system has shown that there can be some vulnerabilities to the gas system. The wellheads can freeze off. You can have issues on the pipeline system. So ultimately, you might not have enough generation to produce during the winter time. And that's something that we've seen with Winter Storm Uri, Elliott, and some other smaller storms. So it is something that we and the industry calls out as a significant risk. I have to say that the gas industry is leaning in as we engage with the different trade organizations, individual companies. We see that they do take that role seriously. Having said that, there is no similar construct to what we have in the electric system to the gas industry as it relates to reliability standards, reliability guidelines, et cetera, et cetera. So we do have a significant effort to develop, we have a work plan that is looking at all the risks that we have identified from kind of winterization, communications, planning criteria, and we have a work plan that actually we'll be discussing with our board later today in terms of what we're working on. But it runs the gamut of areas where we are developing standards, where we're collaborating with the industry to take some of their practices, best practices, guidelines, and see if there is a way to bring accountability to those best practices. Takes the form of studies to understand on a regional basis where the potential issues that we might see. And we did a study in the Northeast, released a study earlier this year that highlighted that there might be some contingencies in the gas system. Let's say a compressor station that fails could take significant amount of generation offline. So how do we address that on the gas system? So that's a range of the activities that we're working on. But coming back, the electric system today, and especially during the winter, will continue to rely on the natural gas system. So we really need to look at our policies, our approaches, planning, operational approaches that recognizes that fact and builds that appropriate mitigation strategies.
Thank you. And I'm really looking forward to seeing NERC's continued work and studies in that area. And that also brings me to my next question. When we're all talking about technological changes, where we've seen in the past few years these big shifts in fuel mix, but also extreme weather, harsh winters, heat events, fire events. What are some big risks you see to grid resilience and grid security that we didn't see, say, 5 or 10 years ago? And I'll start you off with Benton, if you don't mind taking this one.
Sure. Yeah. Happy to jump in. I think one of the things from the nuclear perspective that we see, as a big value to nuclear is actually that reliability aspect. And so when you think about a nuclear power plant, our current fleet operates on 18 to 24-month refueling cycles, and in between those refueling cycles, they're basically operating 24/7. Occasionally you have a little hiccup here or there, but in general, they're operating at full time, and so that gives us about a 94 to 95% capacity factor. And so having that always on, always reliable power is a really good way to help support these systems during these types of weather events. The other big thing that we have too is we hold a lot of fuel on site. And so even if you were in a situation where maybe you were in the middle of a refueling when something happened, you would have that fuel available. And so that just imposes a bit of resiliency there. The other piece too is it's a lot of capacity, and so we're talking about gigawatt scale plants in a lot of these places. New plants may not be gigawatt scale. There's a lot of talks about going smaller, but even if you did, you still have a lot of that energy density there that can help provide that support during these kinds of events. And then the last point I'd make is if you've never been to a nuclear power plant, I highly encourage you go. They are they are some of the strongest facilities you will ever be in. I mean, very thick walls, very strong physical security, and so those plants are very safe during these kinds of events, and so we find that they're very resilient in and of themselves.
Thank you, Benton. And then turning to Melissa, how about from your perspective, what are some of the big risks you see to grid resilience and security?
So, when I was originally thinking about this question, one, we were talking about fuel supply, but obviously fuel supply isn't as much of a risk for solar. The sun, it's abundant, it's plenty. But, the biggest risk for us is kind of the availability of transmission, because if we, you just mentioned a few minutes ago about the grid being integrated and the diversity of resources, but we need to be able to actually take advantage of both the resource diversity and the geographic diversity, because we love good geographic diversity around here. So, when we look at it and we think about the grid, we really think we need more transmission and interregional transmission. NERC, released the interregional interregional transmission. I forgot what the C stands for, Camilo. I'm sorry.
Capability, interregional transfer capability study.
Sorry, thank you.
No worries.
So when we look at it, and that came out with some really good recommendations on that and where how to identify the needs. So we love that, because when one region gets hit with an event, it's not usually a national event. It's not even like always the biggest event. There are abilities to import from other regions, or there can be if we have the right transmission online in order to ensure and provide that resiliency and reliability. And then, if we really want to look at it and talk about those benefits, the American Council on Renewable Energy, ACOR, released a paper in 2021 that really outlined a lot of these benefits. So for us, there are benefits just sitting on the table, waiting to be taken, as long as we start to build the transmission and the interregional transmission that we need in order to ensure that resiliency.
I do hear a lot from different parties about the need for transmission to support grid reliability. I'm curious, Benton, from your perspective, originally when the nuclear fleet was built, it was built out with the high voltage transmission support structure around it. Looking forward, does the nuclear fleet need new transmission, or what are some of the sort of core transmission projects that are of interest from your perspective?
Yeah. I think there are a couple different thoughts here. So I think when we think about the massive amount of new demand coming on the grid, I think hard to imagine servicing all that demand without some new transmission as well. So I think every resource is going to need to utilize that. One of the interesting things we found in the nuclear space is an attempt to try to reuse a lot of existing interconnect, and so there's been a lot of interest in doing what are called coal to nuclear transitions, and so the ability to go into the site of a retiring coal plant and replace that with a small modular reactor or another reactor type, and you're able to then reuse a lot of those interconnects. On the back end, a nuclear plant looks pretty similar to a coal plant, from an electricity perspective, and so you're able to reuse a lot of that pretty efficiently. Then you're also able to utilize a lot of the local workforce in that transition as well, which has been a really interesting dynamic. And so I think we're seeing a lot of interest there. We are also seeing, though, a lot of different sizes of nuclear reactors come around. And so we've got a number of members here at NEI who are looking at developing micro reactors. So these reactors that are smaller than 50 megawatts and can be used in remote locations or used to help bolster microgrids or some of these other kind of newer constructs. And so we do have some advanced reactors that I think will have a bigger role to play in some of these transmission discussions. But a lot of our focus right now has been on trying to reuse as much of the existing assets as we can.
Thank you, Benton. And then Camilo, from your perspective, what are your thoughts on transmission? Because you look at the reliability regions of the US as a whole, and what are some of the core needs for transmission from your perspective?
As Melissa indicated, definitely we have studied the role of transmission as we think of some of the challenges and the risks to the grid. We really need to look at all the options that are available in terms of generation fuel sources that have different roles to play in different geographies, as Melissa said, or in different seasons. So just wanted to say, for example, solar with storage, you were talking about it, has shown to be very helpful during the summertime. We've seen in Texas, California, significant deployment of solar and storage, and with the proper settings, providing the reliability services that we need and the proper incentive mechanisms, obviously. So that's one example. Wind has a role to play, nuclear, gas, all the resources. One thing that we say is diversity is reliability's best friend. We need that resource diversity in the system. As it relates, transmission is another tool, especially as you see some of these weather impacting and regions be tied in terms of the resources they have. Being able to transfer energy from other regions is important, but to do so, you really need to do the studies in a what we call a wide area basis. Look at all the regions, how weather event is going to impact multiple regions to really understand, are you going to have enough energy to move between regions? If you do have that opportunity, if there is enough energy, then definitely we see the role of interregional transmission, especially to connect regions, connect the 2-3 interconnections is significant. We identified from a reliability perspective, at least 35 gigawatts of interregional transmission that would be prudent from a reliability perspective. We don't get into economics, that's for others to work through, and what projects make the most sense, that's for developers, utilities, you name it. But definitely there is a significant role for transmission to play. But the key piece that we learn is, one is that there is no single number. There is sometimes the policy discussion goes, well, we need to have 30%, 20%, you name it, minimum transfer capability. That in some regions might make sense, but not always. If you don't have the generation to be able to transport, you're not going to get the benefit. So you do need to do the detailed study, and that's what we did with the ITCS that Melissa referenced. We will continue to update that because the grid is changing to identify where there is value, but definitely there is a significant role for transmission. Having said that, we do see challenges and we don't see transmission developing as fast as we think it should, as the other generation resources. If I were to say, and I'm digressing a little bit, is we need infrastructure along all the lines, generation, transmission, and gas infrastructure to be able to deal with some of the challenges that we have here. But transmission is going to should play a significant role, and there are many opportunities that we have identified.
Thank you, Camilo. And so stepping back a little bit and going more towards our whole grid perspective, this is a tougher question. So we see risks on the bulk grid. We also see that on the distributed grid, communities and customers, whether they're residential or large loads or manufacturing, also face their own risks more locally in terms of their ability to access electricity and energy. What do we need to know about how those risks to the bulk grid interact with the more local risks that customers feel? And I'll start with you, Melissa, and asking more specifically about when we're looking at these high load periods on the bulk grid, what type of benefits can distributed generation provide to the bulk grid, assuming we can, connect the two? And also assuming, well, these distributed resources, they are built to serve the local community and customers first, probably. But what can they do to also support bulk grid reliability?
So thank you for that. I think first and foremost, like at a very, very basic level, and I'm thinking, as someone who has one of these resources attached to my roof, it's load reduction, right? When PJM is hitting its peak load because it's a heat wave and all the data centers still need to run, it's not adding to the grid. Me and my AC unit in my freezing cold house, because I haven't paid more than the flat fee for Dominion in quite some time now. So it's like a really basic thing that it's just load reduction from a large swath of customers if they have these resources available to them that that wouldn't otherwise be realized. But I think thinking broadly, we can look at things that such as virtual power plants, which is definitely a growing topic in a lot of the distributed resource communities. So for those of you who don't know, a virtual power plant or a VPP is an aggregation of the different resources, and I mentioned rooftop solar, but it can be rooftop solar plus storage. It can be EVs, heat pumps, smart thermostats, demand response generally. All of those things to contribute to either addition to the load or reduction to the load, depending on how you view it. RMI last year released a report that highlighted 15 of these case studies from utilities across the country, and the report showed a lot of the benefits of VPPs that included helping provide resource adequacy, reliability, and resiliency, because again, it's taking stress off the grid, cost savings to customers, like I just mentioned, and especially looking at that in terms of as fuel costs for other fuels might be increasing, the fuel cost for the sun doesn't necessarily change. And then of course, my favorite, which is transmission and distribution system relief, because again, these are, like you said, built to serve the primary load first, and then will add to the grid, and then adds to the grid if capable. So it is a huge benefit just to have these loads taken off the grid during these peak hours, making them less peaky, I guess. And there's a potential scaling of these resources that could add 80 to 160 gigawatts by 2030. I think those numbers might have changed over the last year, given some of the political headwinds. But at the same time, if we are able to take advantage and add these kind of resources to the grid, I think there's quite a bit of benefits that that these more distributed resources can ultimately provide to the wholesale grid.
Thank you, Melissa. And Camila, I think this question naturally comes up in the gas electric coordination topic, just because, you have natural gas being used by large generators, but you also have natural gas used as a primary fuel for heating homes and businesses during harsh winters. So what are your thoughts on that, and how to balance the two of what you might see as more local customer specific priorities versus the bulk grid priorities serving like a larger number of customers?
Yeah, no, that's excellent. That really speaks to the constructs that we have in both industries, and that's where you see some of the challenges on managing through this process or this transition and the use of more natural gas. I mean, in the natural gas industry, the way the pipelines have been built, they've been built based on contracts that they tend to have mainly with local distribution companies that provide services for gas heating and other purposes for individual customers, residential, commercial, industrial. And pipelines get built based on contracts that you have available. And if you have a contract, you go build the pipeline. Otherwise, pipelines are not built in those just hoping that the demand will materialize, nor there is anybody saying, hey, we need this amount of pipeline to reliably meet future load growth. That doesn't exist so the gas industry has built pipelines based on that demand and based on those contracts. The generation system, obviously vertically integrated utilities, they do tend to sign those contracts, and that helps the build out of pipelines in vertically integrated states. But in deregulated states, that doesn't exist. I mean, generators don't really have a significant incentive to sign long-term contracts. Their capacity prices are only locked 3 years. How are they going to sign a 15, 20-year contract with a pipeline? So I think that's where very different from the electric industry, where you build transmission, you build generation based on expected demand growth, based on reliability standards, reliability guidelines that are you build to meet that peak demand. So I think right now, as the use of gas for generation has increased, that's where it's come the two kind of constructs into conflict. And that's where, at least on the electric side, and what we're working in the industry is identifying better planning criteria to identify what the risks are, working with policymakers to highlight these concerns so there is more support for generators to be able to enter into those contracts where needed, to really identify where we have those particular issues on a regional basis, because it's not going to be the same. But ultimately, it's this different type of construct that we have in the industries that is making this very difficult to manage. Multiple tools that we're employing, short of having something like a NERC on the gas side that would indicate, hey, this is what we need to do. That's not going to happen. So identify through studies how much more gas infrastructure is needed. So hopefully there will be support. We do believe the policymaker community at the state level have recognized this. I would say NERC, through the GEAR task force, is really exploring what tools do states have to figure out a way to support the build out of the gas infrastructure to support gas generation. So multiple efforts, but ultimately it's this different way that the two industries have been built in terms of the drivers of infrastructure development that we need to figure out how we bridge between the two.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Camilo. I appreciate that. And I see also with, well, I suppose the need for building bridges between local and community and customer emergency planning almost, and grid planning. That seems to be, there seem to be some parallels to what you're saying in terms of a need for bridges being built there. Benton, when you talk about smaller reactors, I get very excited. And, like you're talking about the some commercial customers being interested in advanced reactors on site. I know nuclear is a very different type of resource in that it does provide that high capacity factor when it's not refueling. But when we're talking about different multiple use cases, which may be serving customers or on site at once and then serving the grid at other times, I also think about flexibility. I know that nuclear does technically have a capability to be flexible and ramp up and down, but there are some policy challenges. What does that look like from your perspective? Are there avenues towards allowing nuclear to be more flexible in the future?
Yeah, I think so. So, I'd maybe highlight a couple technological points, and then I want to make one point on kind of just resource planning as well. But on the technology side, you highlighted the micro reactors, and I talked a little bit about those earlier, so I won't belabor that point. But it's a really exciting resource. We are seeing this ability to use high temperature reactors for process heat directly, and that's a very efficient way to repower some of these facilities. And that's, in a world where your options are either to repower with some kind of clean steam option like a high temperature nuclear or go onto the grid, right? If we're able to power that with steam on site, then that's load that's not coming onto the grid. And so we see that as a benefit. And to your point, exactly, you could have actually even some cogen operations there or opportunities there as well, where if you didn't need as much heat, or maybe you overbuild your heat capacity a little bit, so you have some additional reliability during refueling, and you can have some flexibility to sell that power under the grid as well. And so that is something that I think a lot of members are looking at. But one thing that heat also allows you to do is very efficiently charge thermal batteries. And so we have a member, TerraPower, that is working on a reactor in Wyoming. And that reactor design integrates a molten salt storage facility there. So it's a 345 megawatt reactor, but it can actually ramp up very efficiently to about 500 megawatts using that storage capacity. And so that's designed with load following in mind. The idea is that it can be that resource to fill gaps throughout the day. And so we're starting to see that kind of incorporated into designs. You mentioned kind of the ability to flex the existing fleet and kind of the economics playing into that. I think one of the biggest challenges is just the economics. If you're a baseload resource, it's not easy to shut down these reactors and restart them very quickly. You really want to be, running all of the time. And when you have something that's such a high capital investment like nuclear, anytime you're not operating is just increasing your average cost. And so we we do want to run these as much as possible. And so that kind of dynamic does come into play. And I think it's one of the reasons on the system planning side, we really preach about trying to take a full system approach when folks are doing these resource choices. And I think OPG in Ontario did a great job of this when they were evaluating their SMR project, and they looked at the full cost of creating a reliable system. How much capacity, how much transmission lines do I have to build? How much storage do I have to build? How much of all of these other resources do I have to bring online? And can I compare all of that with what a nuclear power plant brings? And they determined that was a pretty cost-effective way of the system. And in many parts of the United States, we don't price power as a system. We have a lot of subcomponents that we price it as, and so that can make that planning a little difficult. But yes, I think those two aspects are really going to drive a lot of the interest. So we've got some technology solutions, and I think also some policy solutions that can help bring that to the forefront.
Oh yeah, thank you, Benton. That's very interesting, and definitely see the need for even more integrated planning and more system level perspective. Before we turn to audience Q&A, I had one more question. It's kind of open-ended. And I appreciate each of your participation in the Gridiron Dialogue so far. What you've heard in those dialogues so far, what are some key insights that you heard from others, or if you want to reiterate some key insights that you want to make sure are emphasized in the dialogues, could you share that with us? And I'll just let anyone jump in to start with that one.
Sure, I can maybe start. So, I think there was a lot of conversation, about how to drive, investment into a lot of these assets. And I think it's no secret that, power demand has been flat for a long time. And so capital has kind of formed around the utility industries in such a way that it expected load growth to be flat. And so everyone's kind of expecting these, bond-like returns. They're not investing in large CapEx projects. And now we're in this CapEx world, and I think there's a lot of change happening right now. And one side conversation I had during the piece, somebody mentioned, equilibriums exist, surrounded by chaos. And when you find a new equilibrium, you have to work through that chaos again. And I think we're kind of working through that chaos. But we're going to reach that new equilibrium, and we're going to do it, and we're going to be able to deliver the power that we need. But one point in all of that I would just kind of underscore is that investors look at, where the dollars are flowing and where customers or what kind of assets customers are valuing. And so when we think about these uprates at nuclear power plants, no one's going to make the investment to uprate the power plant if they have questions about the underlying asset, the rest of the power plant. And so I think making sure that we're seeing that valuation go through to our existing assets is one of the best ways to help drive that investment and drive that change in capital formation and help us get to that new equilibrium. And so I think that's just the point I would probably leave us on.
I love that point about equilibriums exist surrounded by chaos. Also, when I think of finding order in chaos, I think of that as an inherently creative process. And to drive creativity, we have to have new conversations and new dialogues that we wouldn't normally have. So especially appreciate all three of you being here today. How about you, Melissa or Camilo? What are some key takeaways that you heard in the dialogues so far?
So two of the things that I'm seeing from my perspective are, first, we have to understand the risks that we're actually facing, and especially with respect to the growing load. I think there's a lot of evidence out there showing that we don't actually know how much load AI is going to be adding at this moment. I want to give a shout out to Tyler Norris at Duke University and his Substack for outlining some of the potential load growth issues associated with AI. And then, is it really what it is? Is AI using full capacity of their data centers? It doesn't seem like they are. And then thinking also back to 25 years ago, where there was a similar conversation happening, not the same players, or not the same people in the conversation, but since the industry's changed a little bit, but this industry and the tech industry has had this conversation before. We just need to look back at it and see what happened with the growth of the internet? How did they actually address it? Because they really thought it was going to be huge load growth. That didn't happen. Computer programming changed. The actual physical buildings changed, evolved, and the load growth didn't materialize the way that everyone thought it was going to. So I think we need, first of all, to understand the risks that we have. And then secondly, with respect to the resources on the grid, we need to take advantage of what we have. And I don't think that those are being fully utilized at the moment. First of all, if you think about what resources can provide, talking about flexible resources, storage is a great flexible resource, right? Fast ramping, I'm talking about response times of milliseconds as opposed to like 15-minute increments, quite the difference. And then geographic diversity, right? Like I mentioned earlier with the need for transmission. And then from my perspective as, a tried and true FERC lawyer, I look at it and think, put what we have on the grid, make what we have in the queues, get it from the queue to the grid, and doing so without maybe preferencing any resources and looking at how do we solve the short to midterm problems that we might be facing, and looking at what is actually available, because we do have plenty available to address those problems. So, I have to understand the risk. And then once you get that understanding, you know how to take advantage of what we already have.
Yeah, I think go ahead, Camilo.
No, I was going to add, on my end, a couple of similar things to Melissa and Benton, but independent of how much the large load comes or not, that's definitely a good question. There is the changing generation mix is adding to the reliability challenges. So a couple of pieces that I've heard or things that we're exploring. One is just the use of existing infrastructure and really understand the reliability implications as you consider retirements. And that might require you to extend the life of some of those plants that were due to be retired. So that's one of the best ways to address the reliability concerns. The other one, as Melissa said, firm up some of that renewable with storage. I mean, we've seen the significant benefits of storage, especially properly set up to provide additional reliability services, whether it be frequency voltage, that can provide significant value. The uprates, I think that was, obviously I knew about the nuclear potential, but even in the hydro space in one of our series, that was highlighted as also a relatively, again, and I don't know, I won't get into the economics, but should be a little bit easier than building a whole brand new dam or a brand new nuclear plant. So looking for those more cost-effective ways to help us navigate, and demand flexibility. There is a lot of demand flexibility across the board that could be tapped. Obviously, we would need it to be more kind of reliable demand flexibility would be what I would say, but there are multiple tools we can explore while the infrastructure gets built, because that's going to take time to meet the increase in demand growth. So looking at those and tapping those, all of those tools at the same time.
That's great. Thank you, Camilo. Camilo, Melissa, Benton, it's been a pleasure to moderate this discussion with you. Thank you so much for being here, for your time. We'll now turn to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So I'll turn it over to our energy policy team. Thank you again.
Hi there, Mariko. Thank you, everyone, for an amazing discussion. This first question for the Q&A is for Benton, but everyone is welcome to comment. How are you and the NEI team focusing on some of the costs that are associated with nuclear energy, and how do you see these costs being addressed in the coming years?
Yeah, it was a great question. I think a lot about cost. I think it's probably what I spend most of my time thinking about. So the two points I'd make on that. One is this industry is kind of like a startup at this point. I think we look at the fact that we have so much existing nuclear on the grid. It's about 20% of our energy mix right now, and it's been operating very safely and reliably for the last 50 years. But we really haven't built that much since we built this first fleet. And so we had Vogtle 3 and 4 come online in Georgia, and obviously I think a lot of folks that think about cost look to that project. And I think what they miss is all of the weight of building out supply chains that's placed on these early movers. And so when you haven't built something in a long time, you need suppliers that can provide those parts. You need workforce that is trained and can provide that labor. You need all of those technical skills, all those trades, welders, pipe fitters, electricians, everyone who can do it. You need the project management know-how. And so all of these kind of ecosystem costs end up falling on these early movers. And that's a big problem when you're talking about something so capital intensive as nuclear, because those costs become really, really apparent. If I was building a widget that cost, $1 million and my first couple cost $3 million, and then I know I'm going to get my cost down to $1 million later on, people don't really blink an eye at that. But when you start thinking about a $10 billion nuclear plant that comes in at 30 billion, right? That's a very big number. And so I think one of the big pieces that we have to get to is we have to get through some of these early mover challenges. And I think there's a role for some policy support there. I think we've also seen folks really start to take a much more deliberate approach at planning and making sure that before you start building, all of these other pieces are in place, because the cost of having them not in place can be really dramatic. And so I think that's one aspect for at least early movers that we have to work through. But I think once we start moving, we will come down the cost curve, just like we've seen solar and wind and every other technology. Just like we saw hydraulic fracturing come down the cost curve. Those learnings will take place, and there's a lot of opportunity for them. And so we're really excited about that aspect. The other piece I would point to is that, when we think about cost, we do need to be thinking about system cost and not just per unit of power. It's not a commodity, it's a service in a lot of ways. And so, if you're a data center that requires really high levels of reliability, you're going to put a premium on that. And so I think, cost compared to what, and we think that the value that we're providing is really commensurate with what the value that a lot of these customers are expecting. And so that's the other piece I like to make on that point.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And this next question is for Melissa, but again, anyone can comment. What are you and SEIA doing to ensure that solar remains a viable option for customers under the current regulatory agenda and market dynamics?
That is a really, really good question. I think on the legislative side, I just want to point out, I am not the legislative side, I am the regulatory side at FERC. I'll tell you what I'm doing at FERC in just a minute. But on the legislative side, we have a fantastic and incredibly hardworking legislative team that is, talking to Congress, demonstrating all of the amazing benefits that solar and storage have to offer to the grid in order to ensure American dominance in energy. So, we have our fantastic team doing everything they can over there. And I cannot speak highly enough of these people. They're so good at their jobs. And then from my side, on the regulatory side, right, I mentioned I'm SEIA's FERC lawyer. It's all about markets, right? One of the basic tenets of the policy, the FERC policy at SEIA is basically free, open, fair markets, making sure they're unencumbered by any sort of out-of-market actions, and just making sure that open access stays very much the law of the land, because open access ensures the highest amount of benefits for consumers, lowest cost for consumers, most innovation for consumers, as long as we maintain open access. So we are working hard to protect open access and do what we can and ensure that markets are designed in a way that will really fully compensate the benefits of all resources on the grid in the way that they benefit the grid.
Thank you, Melissa. This next question is for Camilo. Are there any upcoming reports NERC will be publishing on electricity reliability and the energy transition that industry leaders should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, definitely not shortage of reports coming out of NERC. Some are technical in nature, so I would let those for the technical teams. A couple ones, as I indicated, one is tomorrow, actually, our board will be reviewing and accepting, if they decide to accept, what we call the risk report. So this is an effort that we put every 2 years. It's driven by the industry, where they evaluate and assess and put a report that highlights what are the main risks to the reliability and security of the grid. So there will be 6 different themes that you would see: large loads and the changing resource mix, natural gas, security, supply chain, policy, and I forget, large weather events. So those are the 6 themes. So I would recommend that. The other piece is that we're working through our main piece of reports that we publish every year is what we call our long-term reliability assessment. Every year we look 10 years into the future and see the trends impacting reliability. So we are through a very 3-4 year process of upgrading our assessments to bring more information, more detailed information, looking at more regional assessments, scenarios like Melissa talked about, how big is the load growth, or how much are we really going to retire. So I would say that's going to come later this year. The long-term reliability assessment will be a critical feature. And the last one that I will call out is we're doing a lot of work on thinking through the energy planning criteria and how that needs to be evolving, all the way to the impact to, for example, the effective load carrying capability, and how we need to think about the methodologies that are being used across the US, and how to bring some consistency if needed. So that probably will come later this year as it relates to some recommendations on methodologies and how we think about reliability planning criteria. So 3 that come to mind. There are many more, but I'll stick to those 3 for now for folks to pay attention to.
Thank you. All right, everyone, make sure to go look those up after this webinar. And the next question is for Mariko. We got an even spread, a question for everyone. So Mariko, what are you seeing in California in terms of electricity prices and projections for load growth?
Oh dear. California is kind of its own universe, so I don't think it's that representative of the rest of the US. But as many of you know, California electricity prices are extremely high. I think we're second to Hawaii, maybe. And projections are, and I'm talking about the total retail price, or that they will continue to go up. There are a lot of needs on the system to modernize and build out the system, not just in terms of bulk grid resources, but on the distributed side. And then in California, as you may know, we have a high penetration of distributed resources. So customers are also paying out of pocket. There's a high energy burden here. And I was very interested in a couple of the panelists had mentioned or touched on needs for more integrated planning and changes in our planning process. I think a lot of the burden for cost increases as we look forward may be alleviated somewhat by doing more integrated planning and coordinating across types of planning proceedings that don't normally coordinate with each other. We hadn't needed to before, but now we do. So I'll just leave it at that. I hope I answered your question. Costs very high, going to be increasing in California, but there's some hope that I see in the future.
Hope runs a lot of things. Thank you. And we have time for one more question. And this one is for Benton. Benton, could you speak to the complexity of the international supply chains for fuel supply for nuclear power?
In 2 minutes? I'll touch on maybe the most apparent one or most talked about one, which is uranium supply. So we get a lot of questions about uranium supply, and so couple quick kind of 101s on that. Yellow cake uranium, natural uranium, occurs in a lot of places around the world. We can mine it here in the United States. We get it from Australia, Canada, Kazakhstan has a lot of it. So there's just a very diverse number of countries that can provide that kind of material. where we see the bottleneck is actually in enrichment. And so turning that uranium into something that's useful for fuel for most of our reactors. Through some actual deliberate policy mechanisms, we ended up with a lot of that capacity being in Russia. And part of that was after the fall of the Soviet Union, we really wanted to pull a lot of that material back to the United States. And so we set up a lot of trade to make sure that that material could come here and be downblended and used in reactors. And now we're dealing with this situation where we want to get off of that foreign supply and we want to build our own. It's not a technology issue, it's an investment issue. It's very much so investors want to know that they have confidence that they can make the investments in those facilities and that foreign supply isn't going to flood the market in a few years and undercut them. And so we do have a ban on Russian imports currently with waivers out to 2028. We think that is sufficient, and we're moving forward with that. But it is a very complicated process, and we'll post it as that develops.
Thank you. And now I think it's time to turn it over to Jordan, who will close us out. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
No, I just want to quickly say thanks to the panel, and certainly no softball questions from the audience today. But I've got a ton of notes here from Solar and Stores that Melissa was speaking to. I'll give a quick shout out to RE Plus for folks that are interested in that event. Ben, on your side, I know DOE even as recently as yesterday regarding nuclear advancements. I know things that you are quite excited about. And then flowing over to Camilo's work on the bulk grid and ensuring resource adequacy. For folks that are interested in some of the reports that he mentioned and the team alluded to, happy to tag those in the follow-up 2-pager that we do for these webinars. Mariko, thanks again for facilitating this discussion today. For those that are interested, be sure to look out for our next webinar in our series focusing on transmission and all of those issues associated with that. Lastly, from my end, I'd like to thank Mariko again, Ina, Jenna, Julia, Chase, and Bill for allowing all this to take place. I appreciate the panel for taking time to be with us today. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good day, everyone.
Take care.
Bye, guys.